A scorching alarm blared through the cockpit as Elias Reeve wrestled the cracked flight stick, pulses of molten fear surging through his body. Sensors flashed a frantic warning in sharp red hues. The engines were gone, hull integrity was dropping, and the planet's gravity was tugging him down like a giant unseen hand. In the chaos, he realized that if he didn't manage to level out the failing starship, he'd be a crater in the ground within minutes. As the craft jolted against the upper atmosphere, Elias's hazel eyes flicked over the cracked screens, searching for any glimmer of hope. His short, chestnut-brown hair clung to his forehead with sweat. Beneath the frantic beeping, he could hear his own quickened breathing, and every few seconds, his fingers drummed an odd, syncopated rhythm on the edge of the console, an old nervous habit that had never really left him, born from too many years tinkering with alien communication frequencies. He fought to keep the ship stable, but the planet's gravity proved relentless. The hull temperature soared, metal squealed, and a violent shudder tore through the craft. With a deafening crunch, the vessel slammed into the ground, scouring a deep furrow through dense, violet-hued foliage before finally coming to rest in a twisted wreck. Smoke and sparks spat from the console, and Elias struggled to peel himself free of the flight harness. His entire body ached. He touched the faint scar across his chin, wincing at the fresh burn from a sparking wire. That was when something in his chest seized, a brutal reminder that the crash had been far from gentle. Breathing grew unsteady. Darkness frayed at the edges of his vision. In a haze of pain, Elias forced himself to rise. The main hatch was jammed. He managed to push and pry at it, blood pounding in his ears until it finally gave way with a metallic groan. When the hatch fell open, a rush of alien air greeted him, surprisingly cool and carrying a faint, crisp bite. He stumbled out, his legs trembling under his weight, and blinked against the planet's brilliant sun. Towering trees with luminous leaves surrounded the clearing. Their trunks were slender but soared high, and winding around them were vines that appeared to glow, even in daylight. He took a step and collapsed to his knees, chest still throbbing from the impact. Shock hammered through him, cold and unforgiving. As his eyes fluttered shut, a spasm of fear ripped through him. He'd come this far, desperate to gather data on this elusive world, and now he might die on it alone with no one even aware of his final moments. But then a shimmer of motion caught his attention. Through half-lidded eyes, he saw a figure emerging from the iridescent tree line. At first, he thought it was a trick of his concussed brain, maybe an illusion conjured by pain. Yet there she stood, silver-white hair cascading down her back, violet eyes flecked with silver, faint luminous lines shimmering beneath her skin. She walked with cautious grace, stepping closer, as if unsure whether he was friend or foe. He tried to lift a hand in greeting, but the throbbing in his chest intensified, and a wave of dizziness knocked him sideways. She reached him swiftly, kneeling at his side. He saw delicate ridges near her temples, faintly pulsating with the glow that ran beneath her skin. She placed a slender hand against his forehead, and he felt something unexpected, a warmth coursing into him, accompanied by a strange, resonant hum that rose from deep within her. The sensation was soothing, almost lulling him toward unconsciousness, yet it also carried an oddly hypnotic comfort. He fought to keep his eyes open, drawn to the breathtaking glow of her hair in the sunlight. That was when he heard her voice, soft and melodic. He couldn't understand her words, but the tone conveyed concern and urgency. With his free hand, he tried to point back to the ship, to convey that there might be supplies or something that could help. She gently pressed his arm down, continuing that low, thrumming purr, as if she understood his intentions but wanted him still. "Stay," he managed to rasp, though he wasn't sure if he was asking her to stay or admitting he had nowhere else to go. Then his vision went black. When Elias woke, it was night. The starry sky overhead was a spectacle. Vast stretches of unfamiliar constellations twinkled, along with the glow of the planet's peculiar tree canopies. He found himself nestled against a smooth boulder in a small clearing. A subtle ache spread through his chest, but the searing pain from before had diminished to a dull throb. Every breath felt a little easier. He turned his head and saw her again, the silver-haired alien woman. The violet of her eyes seemed to shift as her emotions changed. Now they shone with wary curiosity. There was an odd gentleness about her, yet also a hint of caution, as if she were a guardian of this place. For a moment, the two simply stared at each other, uncertain how to communicate. He managed to get out a few hoarse words of galactic standard. She tilted her head, eyes narrowing in concentration, then responded in a voice that was musical but still foreign. After another awkward attempt, she touched a spot near her temple. The bioluminescent lines shifted color, and her next words, while heavily accented, were somewhat understandable. "I used my healing on you." She paused, as though listening to echoes he could not hear. "You were broken. This planet is dangerous for the broken." He ran a hand through his sweat-damp hair, exhaling. "Yeah, well, my ship's in pieces too. I owe you a thank you for saving my life." He forced a small smile, grimacing against the pain. "I'm Elias." Her long hair caught the faint moonlight. "I am Rienna T'surai." There was a moment of hesitation, and then she added, "You carry a heavy wound beyond the physical. I felt it." That statement caught him off guard. She had gleaned more than just his physical injury. Unease pricked at him. She turned, glancing at his damaged vessel. "You should not move yet, but we must go soon. The forest here, it does not remain calm for long." He tried to stand, nearly collapsing. Rienna steadied him. Standing, she was slightly taller than him, her lithe frame radiating a certain confidence, as if she knew every hidden path on this world. His own legs wobbled, and the leftover adrenaline from the crash mingled with her closeness. He took a breath, inhaling a subtle floral scent emanating from her skin. Strange world, strange woman, and yet something about her presence was oddly soothing. Though gratitude swelled, so did his old fear of trusting anyone too deeply. Memories of betrayal still haunted him. Images of a previous partner who double-crossed him flashed in his mind, but he swallowed those thoughts for now. Survival came first, and apparently she was his best chance at it. To his surprise, Rienna's expression suddenly shifted, her eyes flaring with a faint silver pulse. Her voice grew urgent. "Others come," she said, "ones who do not belong here." She beckoned for him to follow, and though every muscle in his body protested, he pushed through the discomfort, forced himself to keep pace. He didn't have the luxury of staying behind. He needed answers and safety, and for now, she was the single ally in sight. They picked a route under arching vines and among roots that glowed with soft phosphorescence. In the distance, Elias could see silhouettes of figures moving. Low lights bobbed among the trees, flashlights or scanning beams. Salvagers, smugglers. He had no way of knowing. He just knew that if they were searching for him or his ship, it couldn't be for anything good. He swallowed. "Rienna, if you saved me, why?" He almost felt foolish for asking, but it burned in his mind. She paused for a moment, as if searching for the right words in a language she barely knew. "In my clan, it is said you save a life, you share that life." She glanced at him meaningfully. "You cannot leave until the bond is made." Elias blinked. "Bond?" She nodded firmly. "I saved you. You live only because I gave you my healing, my energy. Tradition says your life is tied to mine. You must remain until we complete it." She seemed a bit uneasy with the concept herself, which added to his confusion. But there was no chance to question further. A flash of light grazed the ground near their feet, and she grabbed him by the hand, leading him deeper into the undergrowth. He wasn't sure what alarmed him more, the ominous presence of unknown pursuers in the forest, or the revelation that, by this culture's laws, he was effectively bound to stay with Rienna. Under normal circumstances, he might protest, argue his independence. But she'd saved him from certain death, and there was no denying that. Would it be so wrong to follow her custom for a time, at least until he could figure out how to repair his craft, or until they both found a safer place? His gaze fell on Rienna's flowing hair as it shimmered in the moonlight, the faint glow beneath her skin pulsing in time with her heartbeat. Did he really have a choice, though? She had risked her own safety to help him. He owed her. Besides, limping off alone in this unknown world would be suicide. A part of him suspected there was more to her tradition than just a life debt. He could sense a seriousness about her, a sense that her people had been burned by outsiders before. As they traversed the winding paths, the forest itself seemed alive, reacting to Rienna's presence with subtle twinkles of light whenever her luminous aura brushed against certain leaves. Once in a while, she paused to hum that low, resonant note, focusing as though scanning the environment. On one such stop, Elias felt a predatory snarl somewhere off to the right. He tensed, hand instinctively going to his belt, though he'd lost most of his equipment in the crash. Rienna tensed as well. She gestured for him to stay close, eyes narrowing. The sound drew nearer, harsh breathing, heavy footfalls crushing vegetation. Elias realized they had little cover here. The ground behind them sloped, lined with thorny vines. Ahead lay a narrower path, where the shadows of twisted trunks cast ominous shapes. He readied himself to run. Then she placed a hand on his chest and shook her head. "We stand here," she said softly. The predator emerged a moment later, something like a large feline shape but with spiked frills along its spine and a row of bright, bioluminescent patterns on its flanks. Its eyes locked onto them, a cold reflection of the distant moonlight. Elias's heart slammed in his ribcage. Rienna's hum intensified, pressing gently on his mind. Slowly, the beast's posture shifted from attack to uncertainty. Elias, fumbling with a bit of salvage from his belt, recalled a personal defense device he'd tinkered with on a prior run, a small sonic emitter that might distract or startle certain creatures. Though it only had a single charge left, it might buy them time if Rienna's empathic approach failed. He tapped out the code sequence on a tiny panel, heart thudding. But to his astonishment, the creature lowered its frilled shoulders, pacing in slow circles as if lulled by Rienna's strange resonance. She closed her eyes, concentrating. The lines along her temples glowed brighter. Elias watched in stunned fascination. The predator let out a rumbling growl, but its posture was half wary, half tranced. Then she subtly gestured for Elias to toss his improvised device deeper into the underbrush. He did, and a faint ultrasonic buzz flared from it. Distracted, the beast turned and bounded after the curious sound, disappearing into the night. Silence fell again, broken only by the faint hum of the distant forest. Their eyes met, and he felt a surge of relief. She'd risked a direct empathic confrontation with a dangerous creature, trusting he would figure out how to help. And somehow, though they came from different worlds, they'd worked in tandem. A small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. He exhaled. "Good teamwork," he whispered, though he doubted she fully caught the meaning. He gave her a grateful nod, and she seemed to understand enough of that gesture. They continued onward until they reached a place where the foliage formed a natural dome. A thick canopy overhead glowed with soft blues and purples, illuminating the ground in gentle, dreamlike hues. It felt safer here, the forest's howls more distant. Rienna motioned for him to sit against a broad root. She knelt beside him, touching his injured side. Her empathic hum resumed, but this time it was deeper, more personal. He felt his muscles loosen, the ache in his body ebb away bit by bit. As she worked, he found himself thinking about his old mistakes. His last mission had ended in a fiasco because he'd chosen to trust the wrong person, costing him his standing and nearly his life. Now, here he was, trusting an alien woman he'd just met, and it was the only reason he was still breathing. A disquieting tension twisted inside him. Was he repeating history by letting himself depend so heavily on someone else? Would he face more betrayal down the line? Or was this different, a chance at redemption for the times he'd failed others? When Rienna finished, her eyes fluttered open. She studied him with an intensity that made him swallow hard, uncertain whether she sensed the guilt roiling beneath his calm exterior. For an uncomfortable moment he felt naked under that empathic gaze. Then she spoke softly. "Your worry is strong." He nodded, attempting to muster a smile. "I've been through a lot. Let's leave it at that." She didn't press further. Instead, she reached into a small pouch at her side, producing a handful of dried leaves and a piece of fruit-like substance. She motioned for him to eat. He tested the fruit, tart with a slightly sweet aftertaste but tolerable. The leaves, ground with a bit of water from her canteen, turned into a paste that seemed meant for topical application. He followed her cues, gingerly spreading it over the deeper cuts on his arms. A gentle breeze stirred through the dome, carrying an undercurrent of tension. Somewhere in the distance, he could still sense those search parties, the ones presumably out there for the crashed ship, or perhaps for him. Trying to lighten the mood, he spoke in as calm a tone as possible. "If we're going to be stuck together, I suppose it's best we learn more about each other." Her expression softened. "Yes," he cleared his throat, "I'm an engineer. Good with machines, ships, electronics. Not so good with," he paused, thinking how best to phrase it. "Not so good with trusting people. Let's say I've been burned." She listened intently, although the nuances might have been lost. Still, her empathetic side likely caught the sense of bitterness that tinged his voice. "I am a T'surai. We have traditions, ancient ones. Saving you means responsibility. If I had left you, the forest or the creatures would have ended your life. But now, you and I are," she hesitated, searching for the right word, "linked. My clan demands a bond for your safe passage, for your release. That is our way." He tried to hide how unsettling that sounded. "I appreciate what you've done, but forced bonding, that's where I come from, that's not how it works." A small frown crossed her features. "It is not just for you, it is for my people. Outsiders have harmed us before. The bond ensures trust. Once performed, you cannot betray my clan or me, but I do not wish to force anyone. Still, tradition is tradition." He let out a slow breath. In the grand scheme, it wasn't so different from an enforced contract in many places he'd traveled, albeit more spiritual. He couldn't exactly judge. And after all, he owed her a debt he couldn't deny. Maybe if he stuck around long enough to fix his ship, they could do some minimal version of this bond, just enough to placate her clan, and then part ways amicably. That might be the best solution. "Well, let's see what we can do then," he said finally. He noticed a flicker of relief in her eyes. They settled in for a tense, half-sleepless night, listening to the sporadic calls of beasts roaming the forest. Elias found himself peering at Rienna from time to time, her posture, the way her hair caught the dim glow, the soft hum that reverberated in her throat whenever she concentrated. He was grateful for her presence, more than he cared to admit. Because no matter how wary or conflicted he felt, she was the reason his heart still beat. Morning arrived in a rush of lavender-tinted daylight streaming through the canopy. Rienna rose gracefully, scanning the surroundings, her luminous eyes pensive. Elias roused himself with a groan, every muscle stiff but functional. She gestured for him to follow again, and he obliged, hobbling after her as they skirted wide roots and thick vines. They emerged from the dense forest into a clearing strewn with enormous flowering plants. Blooms of pale pink and blue rose up to their shoulders, exuding a sweet, soporific fragrance. Rienna paused at the edge, caution in her gaze. She pointed to the swirling patterns inside one bloom. "Pollen can be dangerous if disturbed," she explained. So they moved slowly, stepping around the blossoms to avoid brushing against them. Midway through this maze of giant flowers, a new noise pricked Elias's senses. Humanoid voices, carrying a harsh, metallic echo of technology. Rienna held up a hand, urging silence. They crouched low. Through a gap in the blossoms, Elias glimpsed them. A small group of men and women in worn, mismatched gear, scanning the area with handheld devices. One had a weapon slung across his shoulder, something that looked like a repurposed laser rifle. Another held a metal cylinder that bleeped intermittently, perhaps a tracking module. They wore no official insignia that he recognized. Their presence on this planet was as suspicious as it was unsettling. One of them spoke in a guttural, whispered tone, but it was enough for Elias to catch a few words in galactic standard. "We find that data, we cash in big." His stomach sank. He suddenly understood. These people, likely salvagers, had come to scavenge whatever advanced technology or resources they could find, including data from his ship. That also explained why they were hunting for him. If they recovered the crash logs or any recorded planetary coordinates, they could exploit this uncharted world, ripping it apart for rare minerals or bioresources. He felt a pang of guilt for leading them here, albeit unintentionally. Then a wave of cold anger rose. He refused to let them wreak havoc on this place, especially when Rienna's people were already suspicious of outsiders. Rienna touched Elias's arm lightly, eyebrows knitting with worry. He met her gaze, gave a slight nod, and they both inched backward, retreating into the forest shadows without drawing attention. The salvage group was too large to confront head-on, and Elias had no real weapon, just his resourcefulness and a single emergency toolkit stuffed in his jacket. Nevertheless, he resolved to protect Rienna and her home from these intruders somehow. They finally slipped far enough away to speak in hushed tones. "We have to get to my ship," Elias whispered. "I might be able to wipe the navigation logs or hide them." "If those people find it," Rienna nodded, though her expression was tense. "Yes, they must not learn of the secrets here." He swallowed, recalling his vow never to let someone down again. "I'll handle it, but I'll need time." She studied him, the silver flecks in her violet eyes brightening. "We do it together." He tried to protest. His entire life he tried to solve problems alone, especially since that betrayal. But her resolute stare reminded him that their fates were intertwined. "All right," he relented quietly. "Together." Their next move was careful, circling around the salvage party's perimeter. It took hours to navigate the dense undergrowth and avoid detection. Twice, they nearly stumbled upon a pair of salvagers who were scanning for energy readings. Elias held his breath each time. His heart pounded louder than he'd have liked, but Rienna's calm presence and sure-footed steps guided him away from danger. Near midday, they reached the crash site. Elias's starship lay like a wounded beast, half buried in scorched earth, one wing snapped off. A swirl of thick black smoke still rose from a fractured engine component. The canopy was shattered, the hull a contorted mass of steel. Elias's chest tightened with a pang of loss. He had poured years of labor and upgrades into that vessel, hoping it would carry him to new horizons. Rienna placed a hand on his shoulder. "We must do what is needed," she said softly. Her empathic tone hinted that she sensed his sorrow. He nodded, lips set in a grim line. He clambered inside, gingerly stepping over debris. Sparks popped from damaged consoles and the air smelled of burnt circuitry. Rienna stayed close, carefully observing as he rummaged beneath a collapsed panel. At last, he found what he was looking for: the black box data core and the emergency power supply. If he could purge the coordinate files stored here, the salvagers would have a far harder time pinpointing anything of value. He pulled out a small interface device, flipping open a compartment to reveal a circuit board. "I'll try a forced memory wipe," he said, mostly talking to himself. Rienna stood by, occasionally humming a reassuring note. Within minutes, the console flickered, beeped once, and then died. He wiped the sweat from his brow. "That should do it," he muttered. "Now they can't salvage the logs." Yet the sense of relief was fleeting. Even if the logs were erased, the salvagers wouldn't simply give up. They'd scavenge every scrap of tech or resource. If they discovered Rienna's people, they'd almost certainly exploit them. Elias grimaced. He needed to ensure that his presence here didn't lead to more harm. He turned to her. "We should hide or destroy anything else they might find valuable." But before he could move, a shrill whine sliced the air. Rienna went rigid, eyes wide. One of the salvagers had come around the side of the ship, scanning with a handheld device. The man's face twisted in surprise as he spotted them. He barked an order into a comlink, raising his rifle. Elias's stomach dropped. His only immediate reaction was to slam a lever that sealed the hatch behind them, buying a few moments. The hiss of the mechanism suggested the door still functioned, albeit barely. The salvager pounded on it from outside, shouting for backup. Rienna grabbed Elias's hand, her ridged temples flaring with frantic luminescence. "We cannot fight them all," she hissed in her accented standard. "We must go." He looked around. The cockpit's front exit was jammed. The side hatch was locked down with armed men outside. Then he recalled an old maintenance hatch in the lower deck, rarely used. "This way," he said. They raced across the cramped interior, stumbling over debris. He pried open a floor panel. They squeezed into a service corridor that ran beneath the primary cabin. As they descended, a metallic screech overhead told them the salvagers were trying to cut through the hatch or pry it open. In the gloom of the lower deck, Elias's voice dropped to a whisper. "We'll have to exit through the cargo bay, but it might be open to the outside, so be careful." Rienna nodded. They crept through the half-flooded corridor, water from a ruptured coolant line pooling around their ankles. At last, they reached the cargo bay door. Elias checked the release mechanism. Miraculously, it still had power. He punched a manual override, bracing for the worst. The door lifted, revealing a bright, overgrown section of forest. Some large chunk of wreckage must have torn the hull open, leaving the cargo bay partially fused with the foliage. They dropped to the ground and found themselves behind the twisted remains of the cargo ramp, concealed by the planet's massive fronds. Shouts echoed from the starship's other side. Elias took Rienna's hand. "Let's get out of here." Together, they darted into the underbrush, hearts pounding, uncertain where the next threat would emerge. For hours, they wove through labyrinthine pathways, guided by Rienna's knowledge of the terrain. She led him to a small stream, hidden by dense ferns that released glowing spores whenever brushed. There, they paused to catch their breath. Elias leaned against a trunk, sweat trickling down his face. He realized that in a single day, his entire life had been turned upside down. Not only was he stranded, but he was entangled in an alien custom that demanded he stay. And the more time he spent with Rienna, the less he wanted to simply fix his ship and leave. Confusion coiled inside him, a reminder of old wounds and uncertain desires. When he looked at her, something in her expression had changed. Perhaps a glimmer of trust mingled with lingering caution. She spoke softly. "You see why my people have this bond tradition. Outsiders come to take. They see us only as a resource. We have suffered." Her words dripped with an undercurrent of sorrow, and he wondered what losses she might have witnessed firsthand. He swallowed, guilt clawing at him. "I won't let them harm you or your planet," he promised, though a tiny voice inside asked if he could truly keep that vow. She studied his face, then nodded, her tense posture relaxing a fraction. For a moment they simply breathed in the forest air, listening to the trickle of water. Yet the sense of safety was short-lived. A distant roar shattered the stillness, followed by shrieks. Rienna stiffened. A predator, it must have been disturbed by them. The primal cries echoed. Elias's thoughts flickered to the earlier creature they encountered. What if the salvagers, armed and reckless, angered something even worse? He felt a strange twinge of concern, not for the salvagers but for the delicate balance of this world. Ruinous outsiders could upset everything. Exhausted though they were, they had to keep moving. Rienna suggested a route toward the eastern mountain range where her clan had a hidden settlement. "They will protect us, or we will protect them," she said. Elias realized that meeting her clan might be the only way forward. He'd have to face the bond tradition head-on, among other challenges. But if it kept them safe and possibly gave them a means to repel the salvagers, he had no choice. As they walked, the hours drifted into late afternoon. The planet's sun cast long shadows, painting the foliage in deep purples and reds. Elias felt the gnaw of hunger. Rienna, sensing his fatigue, paused to gather a handful of edible leaves from a thick bush, urging him to eat. The flavor was bitter but tolerable. She also plucked a few luminescent berries, which tasted sweet, almost like honey. Their juices stained his fingers a faint turquoise, and she let out the softest of laughs when she saw him studying the coloration. That mild laughter felt like a moment of peace amid constant danger. He realized how close he had come to never experiencing it, how easily the crash could have killed him. For the first time since that day of betrayal, he found himself silently grateful for another's company, uncertain but strangely uplifting. As dusk fell again, Rienna led them toward a narrower path lined with tall, slender mushrooms that glowed in pulses like a heartbeat. In the distance, Elias spotted what looked like a rocky outcrop, possibly the beginning of the mountain foothills. Before they could get that far, a thunderous rumble shook the air. Low clouds gathered overhead, swirling with flickers of strange purplish lightning. Rienna's eyes narrowed. "Energy storm," she said, her tone grim. "It is dangerous. We need shelter." He threw another glance at the storm forming. Lightning danced in horizontal arcs, an unsettling phenomenon he'd only heard rumors about. "Lead the way," he urged. They pressed on, quickening their pace. The wind picked up, rustling the canopy until it whistled. Dirt and leaves whipped around them. Suddenly, an especially bright flash tore across the sky, followed by a booming crack. The ground vibrated beneath their feet. They rushed downhill into a hollow, partially shielded by a looming rock face. Rain began to fall, except this wasn't typical rain. It carried a luminescent quality, small glowing droplets sizzling when they struck the soil. Elias pressed himself against the rock, feeling the burn of one droplet on his forearm. Rienna motioned for him to stay close, singing a soft, steadying note that seemed to calm his rising panic. In that tight space, the chaotic storm raged beyond them, forging a surreal glow across the landscape. Each crack of lightning illuminated Rienna's face, revealing her worried yet resolute expression. He admired her composure, her refusal to surrender to the elements. He realized that this entire planet was far from passive scenery. It was an active force, shaping their every move. That alone bound them together. To survive here, they had to adapt, trust each other, rely on combined strengths. He pressed a hand to his side, confirming the bandaging from earlier was still intact. The short rest gave him enough breath to speak. "When you healed me, I felt something more than just physical. It was like you knew how I felt inside. Is that normal for your people?" She tilted her head, silver strands of hair catching the storm's glow. "Yes, my clan are empaths. We feel what others feel to a degree. That is why your presence unsettles me. You hold pain, guilt, I can sense it." Her voice softened. "I also feel your hope." He let out a bitter laugh. "Hope, I guess I'm stubborn. I keep going no matter how many times things go wrong." Her luminous lines pulsed gently. "Stubborn can be good. Or it can be destructive. Depends on how you use it." The storm roared on, thunder rolling over them like waves. Elias closed his eyes for a moment, reflecting on her words. Maybe his stubborn streak had kept him from forming true bonds, from letting others in. But right now, that same determination might be what they needed to outsmart the salvagers. After all, he refused to let these raiders tear up this planet. He also refused to leave Rienna to face the threat alone. Eventually, the storm passed, drifting westward. The rain lessened, and the wind settled to a whisper. They emerged from their makeshift shelter, the ground outside steaming lightly under the residual glow. The forest glistened with droplets that flickered in the faint moonlight. Rienna raised her gaze skyward, as if offering silent thanks to the powers that be for sparing them. Elias took a cautious step out, carefully avoiding puddles that might hold residual energy. "We should keep going. I doubt the salvagers would be out in that storm, but we can't let them get the upper hand. Unless your people have a different plan." Rienna shook her head. "We seek my clan. They can help, but only if we arrive before dawn. It is far still." There was urgency in her voice, implying that her clan might move or relocate at first light, accustomed to avoid detection by outsiders. If they missed them, they'd have no backup at all. Pushing through the wet terrain, they pressed onward, the night seeming endless. Exhaustion weighed heavily on Elias, but Rienna's quiet resolve and her occasional empathic encouragement spurred him forward. Every so often, he sensed her hum ripple in the air, soothing his weariness. He found himself daydreaming about rest, about lying down in a safe spot for more than a few hours. But that was impossible while danger prowled behind them. Suddenly, the forest gave way to a narrow ravine. Towering on either side were steep rock walls shimmering with veins of what looked like turquoise crystals. Rienna placed a hand on the stone, eyes fluttering shut, as if reading the planet's pulse. Then she motioned for Elias to follow her into the ravine. There, a small stream trickled along the floor, and the walls seemed to trap moonlight in crystals, casting flickering reflections around them. It was almost magical, a fleeting respite from fear. Elias could see the tension ease from Rienna's shoulders. She said in a hushed voice, "My clan's path. They leave traces here for me to follow." She pointed to faint markings on the stone, symbols that looked like swirling patterns reminiscent of the planet's swirling storms. He nodded, trusting her lead, even if he had no idea what the symbols meant. The path wound deeper into the ravine. At times, they had to step over small boulders or wade through the shallow stream. The further they went, the more he noticed plant life clinging to the rocky surfaces, strange moss that glowed softly, vines with miniature white blossoms. Eventually, the ravine opened onto a ledge that overlooked a broad valley. Bathed in starlight, the valley spread out below them, dotted with clusters of bioluminescent trees. Elias sucked in a breath. It was a sight of surreal beauty. But Rienna seemed focused on a far corner of the valley, where dark silhouettes suggested structures or dwellings. She gestured, "My clan." A mix of relief and trepidation washed over him. He remembered her warning. According to tradition, the bond with her must be sealed, or he wouldn't be allowed to leave. That was if they even let him live among them. He was an outsider who had led dangerous salvagers to their world. Yet perhaps this was the best shot he had at helping protect her people. Bracing himself, he nodded. "Then let's go." Quietly, they descended a precarious path, trying not to slip on wet rocks. When they finally reached level ground in the valley, the trees overhead glowed with soft luminescence. It felt as though they were stepping into another realm entirely. Elias caught faint glimpses of huts or domed structures made from woven vines and stone. He sensed eyes watching them from hidden vantage points. Rienna raised a hand, letting out a gentle hum that drifted through the night air. In response, a figure emerged from behind a large trunk. He wore a similar bioluminescent pattern beneath his skin, though his hair was shorter and ridges at his temples were more pronounced. He eyed Elias with a mix of suspicion and curiosity, then turned to Rienna and spoke rapidly in their native tongue. She responded, her voice calm, though Elias sensed tension. He heard fragments of the man's speech in her accented translations. Words like outsider, danger, tradition, must bond, floated past. Then the man fixed Elias with an unblinking stare and said in halting standard, "You are saved by Rienna T'surai, so you owe her. You cannot be free until it is done." Elias swallowed, deciding to respond with sincerity. "I won't harm your people, I want to help. The salvagers, they threaten all of us." The man's expression remained unreadable, but at least he didn't seem ready to attack. Rienna touched Elias's arm gently, as if to show solidarity. A few more clan members appeared, forming a loose circle around them. Their gazes flickered with mild hostility, but none raised a weapon. They spoke among themselves in hushed tones. After what felt like an eternity, one older woman, her silver hair braided intricately, stepped forward and addressed Rienna. She pressed her palms against Rienna's shoulders in a gesture that seemed both welcoming and admonishing. Elias sensed that Rienna was explaining the entire situation, from the crash to their flight from the salvagers. He could only hope they understood. The older woman shifted her attention to Elias, scanning him from head to toe, pausing at the faint scar on his chin. He felt exposed, especially when she gently reached out and brushed a finger near his temple, reading him in a way that was entirely foreign yet oddly intimate. After a moment, she exhaled softly and gestured for them to follow. Elias felt his heart hammering as they entered the cluster of dwellings. The structures were woven from living vines that spiraled upward, forming natural roofs. Bioluminescent orbs hung at intervals, bathing everything in tranquil, shifting colors. Children peeked from doorways, wide-eyed at the sight of a human. The hum of conversation rippled through the settlement. Rienna explained that these people lived in harmony with the land, using empathic connections to guide vines and growth. It was a deeply spiritual synergy that few outsiders had ever witnessed, let alone been invited into. They soon reached a larger central space, where a fire crackled in a circular pit. Several clan elders, distinguished by elaborate ridges and complex braids, sat on woven mats. They beckoned Elias and Rienna closer. Elias lowered himself onto a mat, mindful of how out of place he seemed in his charred jacket and battered boots. Rienna knelt beside him, a faint purr resonating in her throat that he recognized as some sign of concentration or readiness. One elder spoke in the melodic native tongue, and Rienna translated quietly. "They say that because I used the T'surai healing on you, you are bound by the life debt. If you do not seal the bond, they fear you will bring only betrayal. The salvagers prove they cannot trust outsiders easily." He could feel the clan's gaze bearing down on him. This was the crucial point. Would he stand by Rienna, or would he demand freedom to leave? A million anxieties churned inside him. Memories of betrayal, of letting people down, rose unbidden. But when he glanced at Rienna, he saw not just the woman who saved his life, but a companion he had bled and fought beside in the forest. Her presence calmed him in a way he couldn't explain, so he squared his shoulders and spoke, voice steady. "I will stand with Rienna. I will not abandon her or your people. Let me prove it." A hush fell over the gathering. One of the elders nodded solemnly. Another spoke a phrase that Elias couldn't understand, but Rienna turned to him. "They will allow you a chance. But if you betray us or fail to uphold the bond, it will be worse than exile." He set his jaw, meeting the elder's gaze. "I accept." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the older woman who had touched Elias's forehead rose and extended a hand. In slow, precise motions, she drew a shape in the air, a symbol or gesture Elias didn't comprehend, but he guessed it signified acceptance. Rienna exhaled, tension draining from her posture. She quietly murmured something to the older woman and her expression softened. Then she turned back to Elias. They want to prepare the formal ritual, but I told them you are still injured and we have greater danger beyond. He nodded in agreement. While he wasn't keen on a forced ceremony, he knew it might be the only way to earn trust. If it helps keep the clan safe from the salvagers, I'll do it. In truth, a flicker of curiosity stirred in him about this mysterious bond, about what it entailed emotionally or spiritually. He tried to quell the thought, focusing instead on the immediate threat. He had to think about how to protect these people, possibly sabotage the salvagers' technology or drive them off for good. Though physically and emotionally drained, Elias felt a renewed sense of purpose. Unlikely as it seemed, he was determined to use his knowledge of ships and electronics to counter the salvagers' advantage. And with Rienna's empathic abilities and the clan's knowledge of the terrain, maybe they stood a chance. Yet a quiet dread gnawed at the edges of his resolve. How far would he have to go to prove himself? And would the bond demanded by Rienna's people only deepen the risk of heartbreak if something went wrong? Still, he had come this far. He reminded himself he was alive because of her. And for the first time in what felt like ages, he sensed that forging a genuine connection with someone might not be the worst choice. There in the glow of the communal fire, clan members mingling and casting sidelong glances at him, he caught Rienna's gaze. She offered a small, hopeful smile. He managed a tentative one back, but the question that lingered in his mind burned with an urgent call to action. Would they truly be able to unite, to trust, and to triumph against the threat closing in on them? Because if they failed, it wouldn't just be him losing another ally. It might mean devastation for everyone in this hidden valley, and that, he realized, was a burden he refused to bear again. Hours later, Elias found himself in a small vine-woven shelter near the center of the settlement, his eyelids heavy from exhaustion. A night breeze drifted in, carrying the scent of alien blossoms and the distant crackle of torches. Rienna sat cross-legged beside him, gently mixing a bowl of herbal salve. Her hair fell like silvery curtains around her face, illuminated by the ambient glow from her skin's faint patterns. He watched her in quiet fascination, acknowledging the strangeness of how quickly events had unfolded. He might never fully understand her world, but a part of him wanted to try. She looked up, noticing his stare. He looked away, cheeks warming. She tilted her head. "What is it?" she asked softly in her melodic accent. He cleared his throat. "I was just thinking how if you hadn't come along, I'd be a corpse in that forest, or worse, in the hands of those salvagers. I want you to know I appreciate everything you've done." She nodded, a subtle furrow in her brow. "We do not abandon those who are wounded, but," she paused, hesitant, "I am uncertain about the bond. I believe in protecting my people, but forcing you to stay if your heart is not here, it conflicts with what I feel. Yet tradition is heavy." Elias listened, a pang of empathy coursing through him. He wasn't the only one torn by fear and obligation. The notion that she was reluctant about a forced bond made him respect her all the more. "Look," he began, "I can't pretend to understand your customs entirely, but I want to help you. I'm not ready to run away. Maybe we can find a way to, I don't know, honor your tradition without you feeling trapped. And if we do defeat the salvagers, then maybe we can figure out what the bond really means." Her violet eyes searched his face, the silver flecks shimmering with a cautious hope. "Yes," she said at last, voice just above a whisper, "we must face them. Even now they learn more about our land." He tried to hide the dread stirring in his gut. He glanced down at his hands at the faint turquoise stains from the berries. "I'll do what I can. I've got a few ideas for improvised traps or diversions. If we can keep them away from the settlement, maybe destroy their means of contacting reinforcements, we'll have a chance." Rienna nodded. "Tomorrow the elders meet. They will decide how we act. I will speak for you." He exhaled a sigh of gratitude. "Thank you." Silence stretched between them for a moment, but it was a comfortable silence, neither of them rushing to fill it. 1,000 unspoken questions drifted in Elias's mind. He wondered if she could sense them through that empathic link, that intangible thread woven by her healing powers. Perhaps she did, for the tension in her features softened. Her eyes lingered on the makeshift bandages around his arms. "You should rest," she said gently, placing the bowl of salve aside. "We have much to do." His exhaustion agreed wholeheartedly. "Right," he murmured, lying back against the woven mat. He closed his eyes, lulled by the rustling leaves and the quiet hum at the back of her throat. Sleep claimed him quickly, and he drifted into dreams tinged with swirling purple skies and silver lights. But in the distance of that dream, the savage echoes of salvage ships still loomed, a reminder that the dawn would bring fresh challenges. And as his mind slipped further into unconsciousness, he knew that tomorrow trust would be tested in the crucible of conflict. Would they stand as one, forging a bond stronger than fear, or would suspicion and old wounds tear them apart? Morning arrived with a gentle illumination seeping through the woven walls. Elias woke to the low murmur of voices outside. He rubbed the sleep from his eyes and realized Rienna was already gone. Rising, he stepped into the fresh morning air. Clan members bustled about, preparing food, tending to tasks. A cluster of them had gathered around an elder at the center of the settlement. Spotting Elias, they beckoned for him to join. As he approached, he saw Rienna at the elder's side. She turned and gave him a discreet nod, something in her expression urging calm. The elder spoke in their native language, gesturing at him and the wide valley around them. Rienna translated quickly, softly. "They say the salvage party is growing bolder. We must unite now, or they will find the path here." Elias took a breath and addressed the circle in slow, measured words. "I can help. I know how to disrupt their scanning devices, how to sabotage their comm signals if we can get close enough. But we also need to be prepared if they attack directly." The mention of direct conflict made several in the group bristle. One younger warrior eyed him skeptically. Another older male spat out a dismissive remark that Elias couldn't catch. He stood there, feeling the weight of his precarious position as an outsider. But Rienna placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. A wave of empathic calm washed through him, quieting his nerves. For the next few hours, plans formed. They decided on a two-pronged approach. A small team, including Elias and Rienna, would head toward the salvagers' encampment to disrupt equipment, while the rest of the clan prepared defenses in case the salvagers tried to strike the settlement. Elias explained how to build a simple electromagnetic pulse device using scraps from the crashed ship, along with local conductive minerals. The clan looked uncertain but allowed him to proceed under Rienna's guidance. Despite the tension, Elias felt a flicker of excitement in applying his engineering skill for something noble, protecting people who had welcomed him, however reluctantly. Yet underlying everything was an unspoken undercurrent about the bond. The elders made it clear that if this plan succeeded, and Elias proved his loyalty, they would bless the formal bonding ceremony. If it failed, or if any sign of betrayal emerged, the consequences would be dire. Late that morning, Elias found himself at the edge of the settlement with Rienna, testing a roughly assembled pulse generator. She watched him tinker, her long white hair brushing his arm as she leaned over to see the device's wiring. He felt her presence acutely. Her closeness radiated an odd warmth. "This should overload most scanning and comm systems in a short radius," he explained, adjusting a piece of circuitry. "But we have to be close. It only has enough juice for a small range." She placed a slender hand on the device, humming thoughtfully. "That is good. We can distract them, push them away," he inhaled. "Yes, but they won't just give up. They might retaliate. Are you sure your clan can hold them off?" She grew solemn. "We must." "This land, my people, we cannot run forever." Her voice trembled slightly, enough that he picked up on her quiet fear. He found himself wanting to reassure her. Carefully, he rested a hand on her shoulder, feeling the faint hum of her empathic energies. "We'll do this together," he said. She met his gaze, the air between them charged with unspoken emotion. In that moment, he felt a trace of vulnerability behind her cool resolve. She wore the weight of her entire culture on her back, and he couldn't help but admire her strength. They set off with 3 other clan warriors, all of whom bore slender weapons embedded with crystals. Elias guessed they were charged with the planet's energy somehow. The group followed an overgrown path leading away from the valley, back toward the region where the salvagers had been spotted. It was a tense journey, every snap of a twig setting them on edge. After hours of navigating thick brush, they heard the faint hum of machinery. Through dense foliage, they spotted a makeshift camp. A few portable structures arranged in a clearing, salvage equipment piled up, and a larger vessel landed at the far end. Elias recognized the battered ship design, likely stolen or pieced together from older models. Armed guards prowled the perimeter. His heart pounded. The clan warriors signaled for silence. They communicated with subtle hand gestures, then slowly fanned out to scout the area. Elias crouched beside Rienna, positioning the small pulse generator he'd built. He needed about 5 minutes to prime it before triggering the discharge. That would fry the salvagers' scanning devices, maybe even their short-range comms, rendering them disoriented long enough for the clan to take strategic positions. Meanwhile, Elias could slip in and sabotage anything else that looked critical. A sudden voice barked from behind them. "Hey, who's there?" Elias whipped around to see a salvager stepping out of the brush, rifle raised. Panic coursed through him. Before the man could fire, Rienna sprang into action, her eyes flaring with silver. She let out a forceful hum that reverberated with empathic intensity, freezing the man in mid-step. His face contorted as if struggling against an invisible hold. Elias seized the moment, lunging forward. He yanked a half-finished sonic device from his belt and triggered it at the soldier's feet. It erupted in a piercing shriek, making the man stumble, dropping his rifle. Rienna's empathic hum intensified, pushing waves of confusion into him. Within seconds, he toppled over, momentarily incapacitated. But the noise had alerted the rest of the camp. Shouts rang out. The clan warriors sprang from their hiding spots, loosing arrows tipped with glowing crystal. Some arrows struck the ground, erupting in bursts of bright light, distracting the salvagers further. Elias frantically continued priming the pulse generator, only a couple more minutes. He saw Rienna duck behind a fallen log, while 2 warriors provided cover fire with their crystal weaponry. Laser blasts snapped through the air. The salvagers were better armed, but the T'surai had the advantage of surprise and terrain familiarity. A line of shrubs burst into flames from a stray shot. Smoke billowed, adding chaos to the battlefield. Elias's device beeped, indicating it was ready. He shouted for Rienna to brace herself. With a flick of the switch, a surge of energy pulsed outward in a near-invisible wave, crackling through the clearing. Salvagers' rifles fizzled, their scanning equipment sparked, and the comm antenna on their ship spat electricity before going dark. The meltdown was immediate and catastrophic for the raiders, who shouted in alarm as half their gear stopped working. Rienna watched in awe, the glow under her skin flickering with excitement. The clan warriors pressed the advantage. They swept into the clearing, using illusions, projected by empathic skill combined with crystal staffs, to further confuse the salvage party. Elias was astonished at the synergy. The illusions manifested as flickering shapes among the smoke, making the salvagers fire blindly. Meanwhile, the warriors deftly disabled more equipment, ensuring it couldn't be repaired quickly. In the mayhem, Elias spotted a large portable console near the center of the camp that looked like the salvage team's main data hub. Heart hammering, he raced for it, weaving around fallen crates. A guard lunged into his path, brandishing a machete. Elias ducked, flipping a small stun baton from his belt and jabbing it into the guard's side. The man shouted, convulsing briefly before dropping to his knees. Elias pressed on, adrenaline fueling every step. He reached the console, scanning for a control port. If he could scramble the data or plant a virus, it'd cripple the salvagers' ability to coordinate. Sparks shot overhead as another rifle misfired. He found a panel and quickly plugged in a handheld device he'd cobbled together from the starship's remains. Fingers tapping in a flurry, he began uploading a data corruption script. It was a gamble, but if it worked, every file on that console would become useless junk. Time slowed as he worked, every second feeling like an eternity. Shouts echoed around him, footsteps thundered. He glimpsed Rienna a short distance away, confronting two salvagers who had cornered a wounded warrior. She hummed, the resonance reverberating like a wave. One salvager dropped his weapon, clutching his head. The other tried to aim, but with a final push of empathic power, she sent him staggering back. The wounded warrior seized the moment to disarm the man. Elias's script completed with a triumphant beep. He pulled his device free, casting a look around the battlefield. Smoke hung thick in the air, glowing faintly from the crystal arrows still embedded in the ground. The salvagers who remained on their feet looked disoriented, panicked at their failing tech. Elias realized they might flee soon. But the leader of the group, a tall figure with a swirling red tattoo, was yelling commands, trying to rally them. A fresh volley of laser fire erupted from the direction of the salvage ship. At least one or two of them must still have a functioning weapon. A beam scorched the soil near Elias, forcing him to dive for cover. Rienna joined him, pressing against a stack of crates. Her breathing was ragged, the glow beneath her skin flickering erratically. "You all right?" Elias asked, scanning for injuries. She nodded, though beads of sweat lined her temple ridges. Too much empathic output, he guessed. She had to be nearing her limit. Across the clearing, the tall leader bellowed, "Fall back to the ship. We'll regroup." Several salvagers began retreating, dragging their wounded, though the ship's comm system was fried. Elias prayed that meant they couldn't call for backup. He glimpsed one of the salvagers throwing a lever on the side of the hull, maybe initiating the engines. Panic shot through Elias. They might still be able to lift off, even if partially damaged, and come back with reinforcements. He shouted to Rienna, "We can't let them leave." She nodded, determination hardening her features. Together they sprinted toward the ship's ramp just as it began to rise. Clan warriors dashed to intercept. Laser blasts hissed, forcing them to scatter. Elias felt the heat of a near miss. Desperate, he rummaged for anything else he could use. He found a small explosive charge in his belt pouch, something he rarely carried. It could blow open a sealed door or sabotage an engine, but he had only one. "Cover me," he cried, then darted forward, weaving through crates. Rienna tried to project illusions to distract the salvagers at the ramp, but her empathic hum faltered. She was spent. Another warrior leapt in, hurling a crystal arrow that detonated with a flash of light. The guard staggered, blinded. Elias seized the opening to slide under the half-raised ramp. Heart in his throat, he slapped the explosive onto an exposed panel beneath the ship's engine housing. He set the timer for 10 seconds, then scrambled backward. A savage roar erupted from the tall leader, who spotted Elias. He lunged forward with a battered pistol, firing wildly. Elias felt a searing heat tear across his upper arm. He bit back a cry, adrenaline spiking as he dove behind a cargo crate. 7 seconds on the timer. The ramp continued to close, engines whining. If that charge went off before the ship took flight, they'd be grounded for good. At the last moment, the tall leader realized something was wrong. He turned, shouting an order, but it was too late. A brilliant explosion rocked the clearing, sending debris and flames jetting from under the ship. The engine sputtered, coughed, then died in a shower of sparks. The ship settled hard onto the ground, smoke pouring from the breach. Shouts of confusion and panic tore through the salvagers. Elias staggered out from behind the crate, wincing at the burn in his arm. Rienna rushed over, eyes wide with concern as she saw the blood. She pressed her hands to the wound, her hum rising again, though weaker now. He felt a rush of warmth, enough to staunch the bleeding. The dull ache persisted, but at least it wouldn't be fatal. "Thanks," he breathed. The clearing fell into relative silence, save for the crackling of small fires. The salvagers, battered and demoralized, were either surrendering or fleeing deeper into the forest. Clan warriors closed in, weapons at the ready. The tall leader bared his teeth at Elias but made no move to attack further. Instead, he glared with venomous hatred, then turned and staggered into the undergrowth, leaving behind a handful of injured subordinates. Elias expected the T'surai to chase him, but the warriors held back, as if satisfied with this victory for now. They had won the day, though not without cost. 2 clan warriors lay wounded, and a few salvage personnel moaned on the ground. Elias scanned the scene, adrenaline still pounding in his veins. He glanced at Rienna. She met his eyes, and in the flickering light he saw a mixture of relief and worry etched across her face. Then, without warning, her legs buckled. She collapsed against him, her empathic reserve spent. He caught her, ignoring the sting in his arm. Around them, clan warriors began rounding up the salvage gear. Some of the salvagers might remain at large, but for the moment the camp was dismantled, the ship disabled. Elias cradled Rienna carefully, feeling the trembling in her body, her breath shallow. She had pushed herself too far. "Easy," he whispered, uncertain if she could hear him. As if on cue, a warrior stepped forward, gesturing for Elias to follow with Rienna in his arms. They led him to a nearby clearing away from the fires. A hush settled, replaced by the gentle hum of the forest. Clan healers rushed to tend to their own wounded. One, an older female T'surai, approached Elias and Rienna, guiding them to a small rock formation. She took Rienna's hands, humming softly in harmony, trying to restore her strength. Elias felt a swirl of gratitude and fear. Gratitude that they had managed to sabotage the salvagers' operation for now. Fear that this was merely a temporary reprieve, that the tall leader might regroup. But as Rienna's breathing steadied and she finally opened her eyes, a wave of relief washed through him. He squeezed her hand. She gave him a weak, reassuring nod. Moments later, one of the clan elders arrived, his stance regal, eyes alight with approval. He addressed Elias in broken standard. "You have risked much for us. You fight with the T'surai. This is a great sign of trust." Elias simply inclined his head. He was too drained for a formal reply. The elder continued, "We speak as a council tomorrow about your bond with Rienna T'surai. You have shown loyalty. This is not a small thing." Elias swallowed, a contradictory swirl of excitement and anxiety tightening in his chest. If the clan recognized him as a trusted ally, the bond ceremony might become more than a mandatory custom. Perhaps it could represent a real partnership. He brushed a hand over Rienna's silvery hair, and she leaned into his touch. Before the elder left, he rested a hand gently on Elias's shoulder and said, "Until then, watch your hearts. Danger tests more than battle. Fear and tradition can destroy from within." Elias shivered at the cryptic advice but nodded. At that moment, a single question burned in his mind. After everything, could he and Rienna overcome not just external threats, but also the deeper insecurities that threatened to pull them apart? They returned to the settlement as dusk settled once again. Clan members came out to meet them, some with cautious smiles, others with relief etched on their faces. A sense of communal victory floated in the air, but it was tinged with sorrow for those wounded. Elias and Rienna were guided to a quiet nook, where they were offered fresh water and healing salves. Exhausted beyond measure, Elias sank onto a woven mat, gently drawing Rienna to sit beside him. She seemed steadier now, though the faint glow under her skin was subdued compared to before. He turned to her, voice low. "We did it. We drove them off for now." She gazed at him, her eyes filled with a tenderness that made his chest tighten. "Yes, because of you." She hesitated, then added, "You are not like the others. You risked your life for us. I see that you carry a heavy burden, but you do not let it stop you." He managed a small laugh. "I'm more stubborn than I look." Then his smile faded. "Honestly, I've never felt this protective before. Maybe it's because I've messed up so many times in the past. I guess I just didn't want to fail again." Rienna reached out, her fingers brushing the bandage on his arm. She flinched as though the pain were hers. "Your wound is bad. Let me see." She began to hum softly, placing one hand delicately over the burn. A gentle warmth spread, easing the soreness. He watched her lips part slightly in concentration. Her empathy radiated through every movement. Time seemed to slow. The distant bustle of the settlement faded into the background. Elias's heart beat faster as he realized just how close they were, physically and emotionally. Her eyes flickered up to meet his, and in that moment the memory of danger and violence melted away, replaced by the immediate awareness of each other. He felt his breath catch in his throat. She finished her healing, though it was clear her reserves were still low. Her voice was almost shy. "I heard your thoughts during the fight. Not your exact words, but the feeling of fear, fear of losing me or not being enough to protect others." He swallowed hard. She had sensed even that. He wasn't entirely comfortable with how vulnerable that made him. But at the same time, part of him felt a certain relief that someone finally understood the weight he carried. "Yeah," he said quietly. "My last partner in a previous job, he double-crossed me. That betrayal almost cost lives. I've been trying to outrun that guilt ever since." Rienna's thumb softly stroked his hand. "You cannot outrun pain, only face it, find new reasons to trust again." He let out a shaky breath. "I'm beginning to see that." Then, with a nervous, almost tentative movement, he let his hand trace the curve of her arm. Her skin felt warm, the faint luminescence pulsing in tandem with her heartbeat. A gentle tension stirred between them. He leaned closer, so close he could see the silver flecks in her violet eyes shift color. She didn't pull away. He remembered how, just last night, they'd been forced to share space under dire circumstances, but the tension now was different. It was an unspoken pull. Slowly, he reached up to brush a silvery strand of hair behind her ear. She closed her eyes at his touch, and her empathic hum rose, faint but resonant. He felt something stir in his core, desire, curiosity, and a deep sense of connection he hadn't allowed himself to feel in so long. Cautiously, he leaned in. She parted her lips with a slight intake of breath. Their mouths met in a tentative kiss, soft and searching. The sensation rocked him, a sudden swirl of heat and tenderness. She kissed him back with a quiet urgency, letting go of the worries that had weighed them both down. It wasn't just relief. It was the beginnings of genuine passion, tempered by the knowledge that they'd nearly died protecting each other. They broke apart, faces flushed, breathing uneven. There was no time for words, none were needed. He traced a fingertip along the faint glow beneath her temple ridges, marveling at how alien yet beautiful she was. She pressed closer, her body trembling slightly against his. The hum in her throat deepened, shifting from empathic focus to something that felt more intimate. His own pulse hammered wildly. Their lips met again, this time with greater intensity, a shared promise of comfort and longing in the midst of chaos. She slid a hand around his waist, drawing him nearer. He could smell the subtle floral note of her skin, feel the faint rhythmic tapping of her heart. That electric awareness built between them until words became meaningless. He eased her onto the mat, the hush of the settlement around them. Hints of the outside world drifted in, muted voices, the crackle of fire. But here in this private corner they allowed themselves a brief retreat from danger. Suggestive whispers passed between them, touches growing bolder. The air crackled with chemistry. She let out a soft sound as he pressed a line of gentle kisses along her jaw, exploring the smooth contours of her neck. Her body arched slightly against him, and for a moment he was lost in the heady rush of desire. Just when it seemed they might fully surrender to that urgency, a flicker of awareness returned. They both breathed hard, hearts thudding. She gazed up at him, her eyes filled with longing but also a note of caution. He understood. This was real, not a fleeting moment of lust. It demanded respect, not haste. Tenderly they let the heated tension recede, drifting into a soft embrace. They clung to each other as the outside world slowly seeped back in. A distant clan member called Rienna's name. She sighed, resting her forehead against Elias's. He gently stroked her hair. "We'll finish this conversation later," he murmured, voice still husky. She gave him a small, warm smile, pressing a final, lingering kiss to his lips before they both rose, adjusting their disheveled appearances. A charged hush lingered between them, a promise that something irreversible had begun. When they emerged into the main area, a hush spread through the clan. Some observed them with curious interest, others with guarded approval. They must have sensed the shift in energy. Rienna's face bore a faint glow, and Elias's expression reflected a sense of awe he couldn't entirely hide. Yet the clan had matters to discuss, so a small group of elders gestured for them to gather near the communal fire. One elder, speaking in measured tones, addressed Rienna. She responded in her language, occasionally glancing at Elias. After a few exchanges, Rienna turned to him and summarized. "They want to move forward with the bond ceremony. They say the threat is still out there, but the time has come to formalize our unity, so no doubt remains among the clan." Elias's stomach fluttered. He remembered how only a day ago the idea of a forced bond had seemed unthinkable. But circumstances had changed. He'd fought to defend them, found an unexpected closeness with Rienna, and now, perhaps, "All right," he said softly. "If that's what it takes to keep us safe. But I want it to mean something for you too, not just an obligation." She gave his hand a squeeze, an emotion flitting across her features. "It does," she whispered, "more than I expected." The clan preparations were surprisingly swift. They cleared a circular space by the main fire. A few T'surai lit long rods of glowing resin. Others brought out carved stones etched with ancient symbols. There was a low hum of chanting, blending with the gentle crackle of the flames. Elias stood beside Rienna, heart hammering. He had faced all kinds of perils in his life, but never had he felt so exposed. The older woman who had touched Elias's forehead earlier stepped forward, addressing him in halting standard. "When a T'surai saves your life, your fates entwine. The bond is sealed with truth and acceptance. You vow to protect each other, share burdens. No secrets left to poison trust." Elias swallowed, flashing back to the secrets he still carried, chief among them that relentless guilt he'd never fully voiced. But if this was to be real, he had to speak openly, even if it wasn't easy. He glanced at Rienna, who nodded encouragingly. Summoning courage, he began. "I come from a place where betrayal is common. I was betrayed once, but I also failed to protect those who depended on me. That guilt has haunted me. I can't promise I won't make mistakes, but I promise I won't run from them again. I swear to stand by Rienna to protect her and her people." The clan murmured in reaction. Rienna stepped closer to the fire, the glow highlighting her translucent ridges. She spoke in her language, voice low. Then she addressed Elias in standard. "I vow to honor the life I saved, to guide you, protect you, and trust you. No matter what tradition demands, I do this by choice." With that, the older woman guided them to stand facing each other. She took a small bowl of shimmering liquid from another elder and dipped her fingertips in it. First, she brushed a symbol onto Rienna's forehead, a swirl that pulsed with faint luminescence. Next, she repeated the gesture on Elias's forehead. A strange warmth seeped into his skin. The bowl's contents sparkled, like stardust suspended in fluid. A hush fell over the gathered clan. The older woman began to chant, joined by others. The sound echoed through the clearing, layered with haunting harmonies. Elias felt a tingling in his chest, as though an invisible thread was binding him to Rienna. Her eyes shone, and he saw her ridges glow softly in response to the chant. His heart pounded, and for a moment the rest of the world seemed to recede. She took his hands in hers. He could feel her trembling slightly. Then the older woman intoned, "The bond is made by open hearts. Let no fear or past shadow break it." She sprinkled a few drops of the shimmering liquid over their clasped hands. Elias's breath caught at the gentle rush of warmth that followed. Rienna squeezed his hands. "Do you feel it?" she whispered. Her voice was filled with quiet wonder. He nodded, words failing him. It was like a soft hum in his mind, not an invasion of his thoughts but a comforting presence. He realized that while she and her people were empaths, this was something more specific, a mutual channel of sorts. He sensed her relief, her lingering fear, her cautious hope. It was overwhelming yet strangely comforting to know they weren't alone in these feelings. The chant rose to a crescendo. Then, in one fluid motion, the older woman lowered her arms and the circle fell silent. The bond ceremony ended, leaving a reverent stillness. Elias felt his face flush. He and Rienna remained clasping hands, hearts pounding. A swirl of emotion enveloped them, uncertainty, relief, tenderness, possibility. A smattering of applause, or its equivalent in T'surai custom, rippled through the clan. Some approached, laying delicate bioluminescent flowers at their feet in a gesture of acceptance. Elias exhaled, feeling both liberated and bound in a new way. At last, the older woman offered a small, satisfied smile. "We accept you, Elias Reeve," she said, accent thick. "You are T'surai's ally." Rienna's eyes shone as they turned to each other. Without a word, they leaned in and shared a chaste but poignant kiss, sealing the moment. The clan looked on, some with approval, others with discreet curiosity or relief. The ceremony might have concluded, but the real test loomed. Even as they celebrated, watchers along the settlement's perimeter reported signs of scattered salvagers regrouping. Elias and Rienna parted from the crowd, concern etched on their faces. They'd won a battle, but not the war. Still, that night, as the settlement quieted, Elias found himself in the same cozy shelter with Rienna. A gentle hush lay over the place, broken only by distant chirps of nocturnal creatures. The bond ceremony left him buzzing with renewed closeness. As they settled onto the woven mats, an undercurrent of tension and desire pulsed between them. He recalled the intensity of their earlier embrace. She regarded him shyly. "You feel different," she said, placing her palm on his chest. "Your presence is closer." He nodded, words slipping away. They had shared a dangerous fight, a powerful ceremony, an unspoken longing still smoldered between them. With a tentative brush of her fingers across his cheek, she leaned in and their lips found each other again. The kiss was softer at first, exploring the unfamiliar bond. Then it deepened, fueled by the trust they'd just pledged. This time they didn't resist the pull of pent-up emotions. He slid an arm around her waist, drawing her body flush against his. She let out a soft, breathy sound against his mouth, and his heart thundered in response. He could feel through their connection that she wanted this closeness as much as he did. Every hesitant brush of lips escalated into shared urgency. Her fingers threaded through his hair, and the hum in her throat vibrated with a sensual pitch. They lay back, the shelter's woven mats rustling beneath them. Suggestive murmurs filled the air as hands roamed and breath caught. Each caress felt like a promise of comfort, a silent vow to piece together the shards of their fractured pasts. Their bodies pressed together, heat pooling between them. She kissed along his jaw down the column of his neck, her silver hair brushing his skin in gentle waves. He groaned softly, trembling under the unfamiliar yet intoxicating sensations. Her own breathing grew ragged, the luminescent lines beneath her skin shimmering with each heartbeat. He found himself captivated by that glow, a living tapestry that responded to her pulse. Carefully, he ran his fingertips along her sides, eliciting a shiver from her. It felt intimate beyond physical contact, a merging of energies. She cupped his face, her eyes searching his. "I trust you," she whispered, voice quivering. The simple statement struck him harder than any elaborate confession. He felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. For so long he'd been haunted by failure, by the notion he wasn't worthy of trust. Yet here she was, offering it freely. He pressed his forehead to hers. "I won't break that trust," he whispered back, sincerity ringing in every syllable. She must have felt the raw honesty in his emotions because she tugged him closer, reclaiming his mouth in a fervent kiss that left them both breathless. As passion flared, they let the moment build, body language turning more explicit, a fervent knot of desire binding them. They tasted each other's vulnerability, the quiet moans enveloped in the protective darkness of the night. Finally, just when the scene threatened to unravel into uncharted territory, a soft fade seemed to descend, like a gentle curtain drawing over them. Their world narrowed to whispered touches and the glow of their interwoven spirits, forging a deeper intimacy than either had known. Time slipped away. Eventually, they lay entangled, hearts still racing, a sheen of sweat cooling on their skin. The bond thrummed with shared contentment and a tentative sense of hope. He brushed stray strands of her hair away from her face. She gazed at him with half-lidded eyes, her ridges still pulsing faintly. They spoke little after that, letting touch and the empathic link convey their feelings. Tucked against him, she drifted off to sleep, and he followed soon after, lulled by the gentle synergy between them. Perhaps it was naive to think that a single night of closeness could resolve all their problems, but for now, he allowed himself to surrender to the solace of her warmth. Tomorrow, they would awaken to the realization that their bond had deepened, not just in tradition but in genuine emotion. And with that deepening came new layers of vulnerability and a greater determination to protect what they were creating. Elias woke to the gentle glow of early dawn creeping through the woven walls of the shelter. He found Rienna still resting against him, her silvery hair draped across his chest. Each time he breathed, he caught the faint floral scent that seemed to follow her everywhere. A part of him wanted to linger in that warmth, to keep time at a standstill, but the stirring sounds outside reminded him that life in the settlement had already begun. His arm throbbed where he'd been grazed by a salvager's weapon, and the clan would be meeting to plan their next step soon. He shifted carefully, reluctant to disturb her. Yet his movement caused her to blink awake, her violet eyes focusing on him. For a moment, neither spoke. She traced a light touch across his bandage, checking to make sure the healing had held. He noticed the glow beneath her skin was returning, albeit gently. "You should rest more," he whispered, brushing a lock of hair from her forehead. She gave him a soft smile. "We have much to do." They rose together, tidying themselves in silence, still a bit shy after the intimacy of the night before. The bond ceremony and the closeness they had shared afterward lingered in the air, unspoken but deeply felt. Outside, clan members were already at work sorting through salvage gear taken from the raiders' camp. A few spotted Elias and Rienna emerging and offered respectful nods. It was a small gesture, but Elias sensed the clan's mood had shifted. He was no longer a mere outsider. They recognized him as a bonded partner of Rienna and an ally in defending their world. They made their way to a communal clearing where the elders usually gathered. Smoke curled up from a central fire pit. Several warriors, including those who had fought alongside Elias the day before, were discussing how best to secure the perimeter in case the salvagers came back. Elias saw the older woman who had guided the bond ritual, deep in conversation with two younger T'surai. She waved them over. Rienna took the lead, listening closely as the elders explained the clan's situation in their native language. Elias focused on the expressions and gestures, catching the gist of it. The salvagers were scattered, but their leader had vanished into the forest. If he rallied enough survivors, he could still cause havoc. Worse, there were rumors of a larger salvage ship in a nearby star system that might respond to distress beacons, if any were activated. They had disabled the equipment in the makeshift camp, but the enemy might have backup devices. When Rienna translated the elder's words, Elias's chest tightened. They had won a battle but not the war. The clan wanted to strike first, ensuring the salvagers could never again threaten the valley. Yet the T'surai were not warriors by nature. They relied on empathic defenses, illusions, and knowledge of the land. A direct assault went against their instincts. They had fought back when forced, but anything more could risk losses they couldn't sustain. Elias rubbed a hand across the faint scar on his chin, considering. We can't wait for them to regroup. We need to find them before they patch up their gear. If we delay, they'll figure out a way to call for help. Rienna relayed this to the elders. One of them, an older man with intricately braided hair, replied in a low voice, which she translated. They wish to know how you propose to find the ones who fled. The forest is vast, and our bond with it does not extend to tracking outsiders easily. Elias nodded, thinking back to a scanning tool he had salvaged from his crashed ship. If I can repair a short-range sensor from my vessel, it might pick up the radiation signature of any salvage equipment. Or maybe the clan can guide me to vantage points where I can set up small devices to monitor movement. We only need to pinpoint the largest cluster of them, especially their leader. The elders weighed this. After a short discussion, one of them made a decisive gesture. Rienna conveyed the meaning. They will give you a small group of skilled scouts, a day's worth of supplies, and any crystals or herbs you need for illusions or defenses. They ask you to be swift. Our people cannot live under this threat. Elias exchanged glances with Rienna. I'll go, he said. And I'd like Rienna by my side, if that's acceptable to the clan. She blushed slightly at the request, but the elders did not seem surprised. The older woman who had performed the ritual gave a nod. It was clear the clan understood that their bond was meant to be tested in real action. Having settled on the plan, Elias and Rienna stepped away from the fire pit and gathered their resources. A few hours later, they were ready. Elias wore rough, patched-together gear scavenged from his crashed ship and from leftover salvager supplies. Rienna had donned lightweight armor crafted from woven, vine-like material, embedded with small glowing stones that matched the subtle luminescence under her skin. 3 clan scouts, each carrying a slender staff and a bow with crystal-tipped arrows, joined them. The group set off, heading toward a corridor of old growth that bordered the ravine. Elias led them first to the wreckage of his starship, hoping to salvage a functional sensor unit. The husk of the craft looked even worse in the daylight, twisted beams of metal and scorch marks everywhere. Still, the interior compartments were more or less intact. With Rienna's help, he pried open a panel near the rear cargo hold. After rummaging around, he found what he was looking for, a palm-sized scanning device with a portable battery. It had been damaged in the crash, but the core components appeared workable. He set to work soldering connections and bypassing broken circuits, while Rienna stood watch at the entrance. The clan scouts scanned the surrounding forest. Every now and then, a breeze rustled the leaves, making the sunlight dance across the wreckage. The place felt eerily peaceful, but Elias's gut told him danger still lurked somewhere beyond the tree line. After an hour of tinkering, he managed to power up the scanner, though it flickered ominously. He took a deep breath and ran a test sweep of the immediate area. Static filled the small screen, then cleared to reveal a faint reading to the northwest. He frowned. There's residual energy over there. Hard to tell if it's salvagers or leftover debris from the fight, but it's enough of a lead. They left the wreck behind and proceeded in that direction. The forest thickened around them, the canopy creating a dim, bluish-green light. Giant, broad leaves and bioluminescent vines draped over branches, the air alive with pollinators flitting among alien flowers. Occasionally, they had to climb over massive roots that formed natural ridges across the forest floor. Rienna's empathic sense helped guide them away from the more dangerous fauna. The clan scouts moved silently, scanning for footprints or broken undergrowth that might indicate a large group had passed through. Eventually, they came upon fresh tracks near a shallow creek. The footprints were booted with distinct treads that matched salvager gear. One scout crouched to examine the prints, murmuring that they couldn't be older than a few hours. Elias's scanner confirmed a faint reading in the same direction. It was the first concrete sign they had of the enemy's movement. They followed the footprints deeper into a region of the forest where the undergrowth thinned, and the ground dipped into soggy marshes. Fog clung to the air, restricting visibility to a few dozen paces. Rienna paused, placing a hand on a nearby tree and letting out a low hum. Her eyes drifted shut, ridges glowing softly as she tried to sense the emotional residue of intruders. Elias waited, keeping quiet. She finally opened her eyes, a line of worry etched across her brow. "They are close. I feel anger, fear, desperation." The scouts readied their weapons. Elias checked his scanner again. The flickering display indicated a small cluster of energy signatures just beyond a copse of gnarled trees. He lifted his gaze to Rienna. "We need to approach carefully. If they have any functional weapons left, a direct confrontation could be risky." They pressed on, hearts pounding. The marshy terrain gave way to a clearing surrounded by trees with twisted trunks. Tangled vines wove across the branches overhead, creating a partial ceiling. In the center of this clearing, Elias saw the salvage leader, the tall man with the swirling red tattoo, pacing angrily. A handful of his followers stood nearby, tinkering with a half-rigged communication device they must have salvaged from the destroyed camp. Elias counted 5 of them. 2 brandished rifles, though they looked damaged. Another was fussing over a battered metal cylinder that might be a power source. He spotted no sign of additional backup, which was a small mercy. Still, if that makeshift comm started broadcasting, they could summon a bigger ship that would bring devastation. He crouched behind the trunk of a fallen tree, gesturing for Rienna and the scouts to fan out. The plan was straightforward: disrupt or destroy that comm unit before they could activate it and disable the salvagers while they were disorganized. Rienna gripped her staff, face set with determination. The scouts drew their bows, crystal-tipped arrows at the ready. Elias crept around the left flank, peeking through vines and heavy moss. He spied the tall leader shouting orders. The group seemed on edge, probably aware that the T'surai or Elias might come for them. One salvager adjusted a small satellite dish mounted on the metal cylinder, cursing each time it sparked. Elias's scanner beeped softly, indicating a power surge from that device. They were close to powering it up. He took a deep breath and signaled with 2 fingers. The scouts sprang into action. One fired an arrow that streaked through the air, lodging into a nearby log and exploding in a sudden flash of bright light. The salvagers yelled in alarm. Another scout loosed an arrow that detonated in a burst of thick smoke, enveloping the area. Rienna added to the confusion by summoning a faint empathic projection. subtle illusions that distorted the salvagers' perception of shapes and distances. Elias took advantage of the chaos. He sprinted low across the muddy ground, heading for the metal cylinder. One salvager caught sight of him and raised a rifle. Before he could fire, a crystal-tipped arrow whizzed past, striking the rifle's barrel. The shot went wide, scorching a nearby bush. Elias pressed on, heart pounding. Smoke curled around him, stinging his eyes. He reached the comm device, rummaging through his belt for the small sabotage charge he had rigged that morning. He planted it against the panel, trying to arm it quickly. Behind him, he heard shouting as the tall leader realized what was happening. Heavy footsteps thudded through the mud. Elias had only a few seconds. He pressed the activation button, feeling the device vibrate to confirm the start of its short countdown. 2 salvagers burst through the smoke. Elias spun, caught off guard. One swung the butt of a broken rifle at his head, forcing him to duck. The other lunged with a crude knife. Elias twisted aside but felt the blade slice the fabric of his sleeve. He stumbled back, raising an arm to shield himself. Despite the adrenaline coursing through him, he wasn't a trained fighter. He was an engineer whose best defense was his mind and a few gadgets. Before they could close in, Rienna appeared, staff in hand. With a graceful pivot, she struck one salvager across the torso. The empathic crystals embedded in the staff pulsed, emitting a disorienting wave that sent him staggering backward. The second salvager lashed out at Rienna. She dodged, humming a focused note that made the attacker hesitate, blinking in confusion. Elias used the moment to scramble away. A deep roar echoed across the clearing. The tall leader emerged from the swirling smoke, face twisted in fury. He aimed a half-functional pistol at Elias, snapping off a shot that seared into the mud at his feet. Sparks erupted from the pistol's failing energy pack, but it still posed a lethal threat at close range. Elias had to keep him busy just a few more seconds. The sabotage charge on the cylinder was about to detonate, hopefully taking out their last chance at sending an off-world signal. Rienna tried to intercept the leader, but he flung out a metal baton, striking her shoulder. She staggered, letting out a pained cry. The leader sneered at Elias, eyes wild. "You cost me everything. Now I'll make sure you die on this miserable rock." Elias clenched his jaw. "You brought it on yourself." He glanced quickly at the sabotage device. 5 seconds. He lunged sideways, hoping to pull the leader's aim off Rienna. The man fired again, the shot skimming Elias's side. A hot sting ripped through him, but he gritted his teeth. 4 seconds. Rienna, her face etched with pain, pressed a hand to her shoulder, gathering her empathic strength. The glow at her temple ridges grew bright. With a desperate cry, she unleashed a powerful wave that struck the leader's psyche like a hammer. He faltered, pistol dropping as he clutched his head. 3 seconds. Rienna rushed him, staff raised to deliver a disabling blow. But the man was bigger and stronger, fueled by rage. He wrested the staff from her grip, hurling it aside. She tumbled to the ground, gasping. Elias, ignoring his own wound, grabbed a broken piece of salvage from the ground. 2 seconds. He rammed it against the leader's back, hoping to knock him off balance. The leader stumbled forward, almost colliding with the still-live comm cylinder. 1 second. The tall man realized too late. The sabotage charge erupted in a flash of white light, an explosive pop that sent fragments of metal and circuitry flying. A shockwave rippled the air, knocking Elias off his feet. The leader was thrown sideways, smashing into the trunk of a nearby tree with a sickening thud. Smoke billowed from the remains of the device and sparks rained down. Elias lay in the mud, ears ringing. Pain flared in his side and shoulder. He forced himself to sit up, glancing around. The cylinder was shredded, molten pieces scattering the clearing. The other salvagers were either incapacitated or fleeing. 2 scouts were already giving chase, their crystal weapons glinting. Rienna knelt nearby, panting, her staff out of reach. She clutched her injured shoulder. He crawled to her, ignoring his own throbbing body. "You okay?" He gasped, leaning in to check on her. She winced, sweat beading on her brow. "I'll manage. You," he swallowed. "I've been better." He looked to the side where the tall leader had landed. The man lay motionless against the tree, eyes half open, chest barely moving. Elias felt a hollow pang. Despite everything, he had never intended to kill anyone. He crawled closer to confirm the salvager's condition. The leader's gaze flickered with hostility, but he was too broken to move. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead. "You ruin," the man croaked, voice rasping. Elias met his eyes. Despite the man's hatred, there was a flicker of terror and regret. He coughed wetly, body shaking. With a final breath, he went limp. Elias stared, chest tightening. Rienna approached quietly, placing a trembling hand on his arm. The empathic echo of the man's final moments must have reverberated through her. Elias inhaled sharply, feeling a mix of shock and relief, uncertain how to process it. They turned away from the body, feeling a strange emptiness where adrenaline had been. The scouts gathered, confirming that the rest of the salvagers had fled or were incapacitated. One scout signaled that the comm device was destroyed beyond repair. With that, any chance of calling reinforcements had been wiped out. Exhaustion weighed heavily on Elias. He nearly collapsed from blood loss and fatigue, but Rienna caught him, her good arm wrapping around his waist. She hummed a faint note, trying to dull his pain. One of the scouts hurried over, producing a bandage soaked in medicinal sap from their satchel. They pressed it to Elias's wound, securing it with strips of cloth. Rienna's voice was soft, shaken. "It's over." She still clutched her shoulder, wincing each time she moved. "We stopped them." Elias leaned against her, his breath ragged. "Yeah, we did." A wave of relief warred with the sting of everything they had endured. Even if a few salvagers remained in the forest, they would be leaderless and without off-world aid. The clan would be able to track them down or force them away from the valley. Their planet might finally have a chance at peace. They limped back toward the settlement, drained yet victorious. The sun climbed higher, illuminating the dense canopy. Bird-like creatures screeched overhead, startled by the commotion. On the trek, Rienna worked small pulses of healing into Elias's battered side and her own shoulder, enough to stop the bleeding and prevent infection. It wasn't enough for complete relief, but it kept them on their feet. Upon arriving, they were greeted with anxious faces. Then, when people realized they had succeeded, a wave of relief and quiet celebration rippled through the settlement. Clan elders hurried forward to examine the wounded. Word spread quickly that the salvagers' communication array was destroyed and their leader had fallen. For the first time in ages, the T'surai could breathe without the immediate threat of exploitation. Elias and Rienna were taken to a healing tent, where skilled empaths and herbalists combined their efforts. Elias's injuries were patched up with salves that soothed the burn. He felt a curious internal warmth each time a T'surai healer hummed a note, focusing empathic energy on torn muscles. Rienna's shoulder was treated similarly, though a deep bruise lingered. When the healers finished, they urged both to rest. That evening, the clan arranged a small gathering by the fire to honor those who fought. Although the T'surai were generally peaceful, they understood the necessity of celebrating a hard-won defense. Elders spoke in solemn tones, praising the bravery of their scouts and acknowledging Elias's and Rienna's role. A soft chorus of T'surai chanting filled the air, echoing among the vine-woven shelters. Elias sat beside Rienna on a low wooden bench near the fire, the crackle of flames casting shifting light across their faces. He felt every ache in his body, but a deeper warmth stirred in his chest each time he looked at her. They had fought side by side, shared injuries and triumphs, witnessed life and death. It was a bond forged through danger and sealed by mutual trust. She leaned her head on his uninjured shoulder. "Our clan is safe now, thanks to you," she murmured. He shook his head gently. "They fought just as hard. I only helped." She smiled, a tired but genuine expression that made her eyes glow with a soft silver light. "You have done more than help. You stood with us when you could have chosen to run." He closed his eyes, remembering the countless times in his life he had run from responsibility or kept people at arm's length. He thought about the guilt that had shadowed him after being betrayed, how he had refused to open up again. Yet here, on a distant world, surrounded by strangers who had become friends, he had found a cause worth fighting for and a person worth trusting. A hush settled around the fire as the eldest woman of the clan stood, staff in hand. She looked over the group, then spoke in the T'surai tongue. Rienna translated softly. "She says our people must honor each life lost. Even when an enemy falls, it leaves a mark on the land and on our hearts. But we also celebrate that we remain, that the forest has not been burned or poisoned for profit." Elias bowed his head respectfully. He thought of the salvage leader's final moments. The memory sent a shiver through him. He felt Rienna's hand clasp his, empathically sensing his turmoil. When the elder's speech ended, others began to sing a low, harmonic piece that soared beautifully under the starlit sky. Afterward, the clan dispersed to their huts and shelters, though a few lingered by the fire to talk quietly. Elias helped Rienna to her feet, her arm looped around his waist for support. They headed back to the small structure they now shared. Once inside, they collapsed onto the mats, too drained for conversation. She rested her head against his chest, and he stroked her hair, comforted by her closeness. Night settled, and they fell asleep to the distant sounds of gentle chanting and rustling leaves. In the morning, a crisp air drifted in, carrying the scent of dew and blooming vines. Elias woke before Rienna, carefully easing out from beneath her. He stepped outside, stretching sore muscles. A few clan members waved in greeting. He realized that for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt a sense of belonging. It wasn't just the bond ceremony or the alliance in battle. It was the acceptance woven through each small gesture from the T'surai. Rienna emerged soon after, hair tousled. She greeted him with a tired smile. They made their way to a breakfast area where they received bowls of warm broth and fruit. The sweet, tangy flavors reminded Elias that alien cuisine could be surprisingly comforting. As they ate, a young scout approached to share news. No sign of salvagers in the vicinity. Some might still be lost in the deeper forest, but the immediate threat was gone. This set off a wave of cautious optimism throughout the settlement. People spoke more freely, some even laughing as children darted around playing games. Elias watched with quiet admiration. These were good people, living in harmony with a land that had nearly been robbed from them. He felt a surge of pride at having played a part in preserving their way of life. After the meal, Elias and Rienna visited the elders to discuss the next steps. Though the salvagers posed less danger now, the clan wanted to ensure no other off-worlders stumbled onto the planet uninvited. A few T'surai engineers proposed reinforcing the natural energy shield around certain regions, hoping to cloak them from external scans. Elias explained how he might adapt starship components to strengthen the dampening field. The elders were intrigued, agreeing to consider it further. That afternoon, Rienna led Elias along a winding path through a part of the forest he had never seen before. She carried a small pouch of medicinal plants, occasionally stopping to gather more. The sun filtered through the canopy in shafts of golden light. Overhead, bird-like creatures with iridescent wings flitted from branch to branch. He glanced her way. "It's beautiful here." She looked at the vines overhead. "It is, and I want to show you something." She pointed toward a hidden entrance among the roots of an enormous tree. Ducking, they entered a hollow that opened into a wide grotto lit by glowing fungi. A gentle trickle of water echoed through the chamber. The air felt cool and serene, the walls decorated with ancient symbols carved into stone. Elias looked around, marveling at the subtle luminescence dancing across damp surfaces. "It's like a secret sanctuary," she nodded. "My ancestors used this place to meditate, sometimes to forge deeper connections. I wanted us to come here." He sensed the significance. The quiet hush gave them privacy, removed from the bustle of the clan. She set down her pouch, then turned to face him. The bioluminescent fungi cast a soft radiance, illuminating the gentle lines of her face. She looked both vulnerable and resolute. He felt his heart thud. "Is everything all right?" She stepped closer. "I want to talk about us, about what comes after. The bond is sealed, but we are still two different souls. You came here from the stars with your own life. My people mean everything to me, but that doesn't mean I've forgotten that one day you might wish to leave." Her words hit him like a wave. He had avoided thinking about it, focusing instead on the immediate crisis. Now that the salvagers were scattered, the question returned. Would he repair his ship and take off, returning to the drifter's life he knew? Before he could speak, she continued, voice trembling. "I won't force you to stay. The bond ceremony was meant to ensure trust, not to cage you. But part of me fears the day you decide it's time to depart." He swallowed hard. "Rienna, when I crashed here, my only goal was to fix my ship and move on. But in the time I've spent with you, with your people, I've realized that I was always running from something. I was never happy just drifting, trying to outrun my own failures. Now, this place and you, it's the first time I've felt like I could be part of something real." She watched him, the luminescence of the grotto reflecting in her violet eyes. "Are you saying you would stay?" He reached for her hands, feeling the light tremor in her fingers. "If you want me here, yes. I do want to help strengthen the defenses of your world so no one else can threaten it. And I want to stand by your side, not just because of tradition, but because you've shown me what it is to trust again." Her expression softened, relief warring with disbelief. "You would give up the stars for this one planet?" He shook his head, smiling gently. "Giving up the stars isn't what it feels like. It feels more like finding a home. And if one day we decide to travel off-world together for some reason, we can do that. But I'm not running. Not anymore." She let out a shaky breath. Emotions welled in her gaze, and she stepped into his arms, pressing her forehead against his. They stood there, listening to each other's breathing, the glow around them pulsing in gentle waves. He felt tears gather in his own eyes as the weight of the moment sank in. They slid down to sit against the grotto's stone, hands entwined. He leaned in, brushing a tender kiss against her temple. She curled into him, and they stayed like that for a while, letting the sound of trickling water and the glow of the fungi envelop them. The bond they shared hummed softly, a comforting presence rather than an intrusion. After a period of quiet closeness, he tilted her chin up to look into her eyes. She met his gaze, lips curving into a small smile. He gently trailed kisses along her jawline until she sighed contentedly, her skin warming under his touch. This time, there was no urgency of battle, no tension of immediate danger. Just the two of them, immersed in the gentle solitude of the grotto. He felt the pulse of her empathy as she opened herself more fully. In return, he allowed himself to be seen, no walls or masks. She straddled his lap, arms looping around his neck as their mouths met in a slow, deliberate kiss. They savored each movement, each caress, in that hush of softly glowing stone. Her hands slid beneath the fabric covering his shoulders, fingertips gliding over old scars and fresh bruises. He inhaled sharply at her touch, his heart pounding not with fear but with deep, resonant desire. She lowered her head to press her lips against his throat, and his breath caught. A wave of gratitude mingled with longing. He pulled her closer, losing himself in the rhythm of her pulse beneath his palms. They whispered each other's names between stolen kisses, letting the closeness build in layered promises. Their embrace grew more insistent, more suggestive, as they yielded to the warmth enveloping them. She guided him down onto a bed of soft moss that shimmered faintly under the pale light of the fungi. He felt her empathic hum resonating in his chest, a shared heartbeat that left him dizzy with emotion. They let the moment unfold at its own pace, unhurried. Each caress seemed to echo in the air around them, heightened by the grotto's acoustics. He marveled at how natural it felt to explore her body in this place, as if the ancient stones themselves blessed their union. She curled into him, limbs tangling, both of them breathing in soft gasps. When their intimacy reached a quiet crescendo, they drifted into a fade of profound connection, enveloped by the hush of the glowing cave. In that private space, their bodies and spirits interlocked, guided by the bond that had grown from a simple act of life-saving into a shared destiny. A gentle afterglow settled, the intensity of their union easing into comfortable warmth. Time slipped by, uncounted. Eventually they stirred, hearts still pounding but souls calmer. She rested her head on his shoulder and he wrapped an arm around her. Neither felt the need to talk, content to bask in the glow of completion and closeness. The water continued its rhythmic trickle and the fungi's light remained steady. At last, she spoke, voice hushed. "I have never opened myself to another like this. The bond always felt like a duty. Now it feels like I chose you." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "We chose each other. I can't imagine facing any more of life's dangers without you by my side." They slowly stood, helping each other straighten their clothes. A comfortable fatigue weighed on them, different from the exhaustion of battle. This was a deeper, more fulfilling tiredness, born of surrender and intimacy. Stepping out of the grotto felt like emerging from a sacred place. They walked hand in hand back to the settlement, their faces glowing with a peace that the clan members seemed to notice immediately. No one asked questions. The T'surai respected private moments of bonding, but Elias caught smiles and nods of quiet approval as they passed by. In the following days, Elias devoted himself to aiding the T'surai in fortifying their planet's defenses. He worked alongside a few of their spiritual engineers, examining how their empathic crystals interfaced with technology. Combining elements of his starship's data cores with their crystallized energy, they erected new wards around the valley. These wards not only masked the settlement from off-world scans, but also helped track any lingering salvagers who might be skulking in the forest. Meanwhile, Rienna assisted the healers in caring for the wounded. Her own empathic gifts proved invaluable, soothing the mental scars left behind by the conflict. Word spread that the T'surai had won a resounding victory, not by becoming aggressors themselves, but by protecting their own with unity and skill. For Elias, each evening ended with him by Rienna's side in their small shelter, or sometimes on a secluded overlook beneath the stars. Their bond thrived in the daily routines of shared meals, laughter, and gentle intimacy. He found himself learning the T'surai language more each day, picking up phrases from children who giggled at his accent. Rienna grinned whenever she overheard him practicing. A few salvagers were eventually captured or surrendered, and the clan, guided by compassion, chose to exile them rather than kill them. They escorted the prisoners to the planet's outer regions and warned them never to return. Elias suspected the message would travel across the fringes of space. This world, so unassuming at a glance, was no longer easy prey. As the threat receded, the clan prepared a closing ritual to mark the end of conflict. It took place at the same clearing where they had performed the bonding ceremony, but this time the mood was lighter. Elders formed a circle around a small flame and sang a gentle chant of gratitude for safety, healing, and new beginnings. Elias stood with Rienna, holding her hand. The older woman who had once brushed a symbol onto his forehead now turned to him with a warm expression. In her careful standard, she spoke a blessing. "You have brought peace, not just to us, but to yourself, I think. May the bond you share be a light in dark times." He bowed his head gratefully. Then she pressed a tiny object into his hand, a small crystal that emitted a faint shimmer. Rienna explained it was a keepsake of the T'surai, a symbol of protection for those who walked their path. Elias clutched it, feeling a lump in his throat. As the clan continued their chanting, he looked at Rienna under the soft glow of lanterns. She caught his gaze, her eyes reflecting the same quiet awe he felt. They both knew this was a significant moment, a confirmation of a new chapter in their lives. He leaned in to kiss her cheek and she squeezed his hand. When the ritual ended, the clan dispersed, some chatting in low voices about the future of the settlement. Elias and Rienna wandered to the outskirts of the clearing, where the stars shone bright. The hush of the forest enveloped them. He took her in his arms, resting his chin on her head, breathing in the scent of her hair. She sighed contentedly. "I never imagined my life would turn like this. Saving you was instinct, not a grand plan." He chuckled softly. "You saved me in more ways than one." They gazed up at the sky. Distant constellations glimmered, scattered across an endless black canvas. He felt no yearning to join them, not in the way he once had. Once, the stars had represented his escape, an infinite frontier to run toward. Now they were just a reminder of how far he'd come, and how he had found something far more meaningful here, a home, a purpose, and someone who truly understood him. Rienna's voice broke the gentle silence. "We can build something good here, don't you think?" "Absolutely," he said, pressing a soft kiss to her temple. "There's a lot I can do to help the T'surai integrate just enough technology to protect themselves without losing their connection to this land. And we can explore the planet more, maybe learn about those caves and hidden places. Who knows what mysteries are out there?" She turned in his arms, looking up at him with a playful spark. "As long as we face them together." A small laugh escaped him. "You'll get tired of me eventually." She shook her head. "Never." Then, more quietly, "You are part of me now, through our bond, through our choice." He felt tears threaten again, but they were tears of happiness. He touched his forehead to hers and they closed their eyes, letting the moment cradle them in tender stillness. The bond pulsed with warmth, resonating in a way that assured them both that no matter the challenges ahead, they would stand side by side. A soft breeze rustled the leaves, carrying faint floral scents from the forest. In that tranquil space, Elias realized he had found exactly what his heart had been missing all along. Here, there was no unending chase or lingering betrayal, only the promise of growth, healing, and a love strong enough to reshape destinies. They lingered like that for a while, wrapped in each other's presence beneath the stars. When they finally moved, it was to walk back to the shelter that had become their home. Hand in hand, they passed under the softly lit arches of woven vines, the faint glow of crystals lighting the path. Each step felt final and complete, a journey from one life to another. Inside, they paused by the threshold, exchanging a glance that spoke of gratitude and desire. He pulled her into a slow, gentle kiss, savoring every second. She melted into him, the quiet hum in her throat telling him everything words could not. Their bond, once a forced ritual, was now a steadfast harmony of choice and love. They parted only to breathe, eyes shining. Without speaking, they moved deeper into the shelter, letting the soft glow of the clan's lantern set the mood. He helped her unwind the woven armor from her shoulders, careful of her healing bruises, and she did the same for him, mindful of his half-mended wounds. Each touch carried an unspoken vow of care, the promise of a life where neither had to face fear or pain alone. As they settled on the resting mat, the world outside fell away again. They shared a tender intimacy that hinted at both desire and devotion, slow in pace, weaving a profound sense of belonging. It was the deepest expression of their bond yet, an act not born of urgent desperation or fleeting need, but of mutual respect and an open-hearted wish for closeness. Their kisses became softer, more confident in their shared future. Skin against skin, they communicated an unshakable truth. Here in each other's arms was the place they both belonged. When finally they curled up, spent in content, he felt her head rest on his shoulder. Her silvery hair fanned out, shimmering in the low light. He draped an arm around her, drawing her against his chest. They lay in comfortable silence, the hush of the planet soothing their tired bodies. Outside, the faint glow of the forest reminded them that life continued, a cycle of growth and renewal. Neither of them needed to speak about what would happen next. They knew. He would remain here as part of her world, and she would share her life, her clan, her very breath with him. Together, they would protect this land from future threats, nurture its hidden wonders, and discover more about the mysteries that made it so enchanting. If one day they chose to explore the stars, they would do so hand in hand, forging new paths while carrying the spirit of the T'surai within them. Dawn came quietly, a gentle glow seeping through the shelter's walls. When they woke, they shared smiles that dispelled the last remnants of doubt. Rising to greet the day, they found the clan abuzz with everyday life, tending gardens, weaving new huts, practicing empathic arts. Children ran up to Elias, giggling as they tried to speak bits of standard. He laughed and answered in his broken T'surai, earning squeals of delight. Before he and Rienna parted to attend to their morning tasks, they paused in the middle of the clearing. She slipped her arms around his waist, mindful of tender spots, and rested her cheek on his chest. He felt her purring hum resonate softly, a sign of well-being and affection. He stroked her back, a gentle reassurance that he was here, and so was she. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath, as though acknowledging the final, peaceful outcome of a story that had once teetered on the brink of tragedy. In that breath, Elias recognized the ending of one chapter and the deliberate beginning of another. There was no more doubt or lingering conflict, no threats, no unresolved traumas that would pull him away or keep them apart. Their future, while unwritten, no longer loomed with dread. It lay before them as a warm expanse of possibility. Later that day, when the sun reached its zenith, Elias took a moment to stand on a nearby ridge overlooking the settlement. Rienna joined him, slipping her hand in his. They gazed down at the vine-woven shelters, the vibrant fields, and the cheerful figures bustling about. Farther out, the forest stretched in every direction, dappled with sunlight and shimmering leaves. He felt his heart swell with a calm he had never experienced before. She whispered, "Are you happy, Elias?" He turned to her, feeling the weight of every triumph and sorrow that had led him here. "I am," he said, leaning in to press his lips to her forehead. "I truly am." In that quiet moment on the ridge, they knew this was the end of the story that had begun when she saved his life in a lonely forest clearing. The bond they had sealed, once a tradition that frightened him, was now the foundation of everything they shared. There was nothing left unfinished, no threat looming. Only the love they had cultivated through hardship and hope. They lingered a while, simply breathing in the beauty of the land. Then they turned, making their way back down the path toward the settlement and into a future they would shape together. Their story reached its closing page without leaving any shadows to chase or questions unanswered. For Elias Reeve and Rienna T'surai, the ending was complete. Two hearts forever bound by choice, devoted to each other and to the life they had embraced on this remarkable world.